The purpose of this video podcast is to introduce you to the ways in which hydrologic science can be used to answer questions about how water is moved and stored in a tree canopy and down to the ground in different forest settings. The first case study involves looking at Mediterranean pine forest. So this is very similar to the setting of where we live here in Davis, California, but this study actually comes from agricultural fields in Spain. Just like in regions of the United States and other developed regions of the world, Spain went through a period of abandonment of agriculture as people centralized in urban centers where there were more jobs. As a result of that, those abandoned agricultural fields have regrown new forests. And that means that there's going to be a change in the water balance as those forests evapotranspire more of the available water away and other related effects. So in this case, the research was looking at three specific questions about how a forest with the kind of species that were present there respond with hydrological processes. The first question is just the most basic thing of all. What is the amount of interception in a Mediterranean mountainous field that is afforesting? So to afforest means for a tree to come back. Sorry, for a forest to come back. The second question is, what is the spatial variability of mass balance components? Mass balance components are precipitation, interception, throughfall, and Stemflow. Spatial variability means that what's happening under one tree or one canopy area, is that similar or different to what's happening under another tree or another canopy area? And then finally, what is the effect of temporal scaling on interception? That means as you go from short time scales to longer time scales like hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, annually, do you see differences in the numbers as a result of what spatial scale you look at? So previously I've told you that hydrology is all about budgeting, and you can see that budgeting is embedded in all of these questions. But it's not just limited to budgeting. It's also trying to use the budget to ask broader scale theoretical questions that are really at the heart of what hydrology is all about. What are spatial patterns and what are temporal patterns? In this case study, the setting was coastal Spain, as I said, and in this case it was a single species that was present there, which is Scots pine. It's the most widely distributed pine in Catalonia. It grows on diverse substrata and over a wide altitudinal range. The young trees are generally conical, and as they grow older, their shape becomes a little irregular, as you see here. And for those of you in California, if you go to Point Reyes or anywhere along the coast, you can see this species is present there, and it gets contorted by the wind and fog drip and other things that are going on. So for all the case studies that I'm going to give, especially when I'm going into more depth about a case study, I'm going to give you a range of numbers that help to characterize the setting. In and of themselves, these numbers don't tell you a whole lot, but as you look over the arc of these lectures on forests, then you'll be able to intercompare them and get a better appreciation for what's a big number or a small number in terms of water flux or some sort of vegetative metric. It also exposes you to different metrics, and an important goal of looking at these different case studies is to see that different scientists have different approaches for how they're going to address similar questions. Sometimes you'll find that those different approaches will all lead to about the same answer, and sometimes you'll see interesting differences. So in this case, they went to a single plot that was just under 200 square meters, and this is an area with about 33 inches of rain per year, which is roughly double what we have here in Sacramento, so a little bit wetter. The density of trees is 2,400 stems per hectare, and then the average diameter at breast height, so looking, that's a common tool that's used in ecological measurement of vegetation. You just take a tree caliper and you just squeeze it together and you measure that diameter of the tree at about the height of your chest. And that average diameter is 14.3 centimeters, which isn't particularly big. These trees are about 10 meters high, so those are relatively small, and they're about 33 years old on average. The experimental design is shown in this layout here and in text on the next slide. The idea is that the circles represent trees of different diameters, and the symbology of that sizing is shown here. And this is that plot. Note that it's not exactly like a square plot. And then the different instruments are listed here. One of the interesting things is that in the previous lecture introducing the concepts, I covered the idea of a tipping bucket rain gauge. So that's a gauge that can measure the intensity of rainfall through time by tipping a bucket as a measured volume is accumulated. Well, if you just take an individual tipping bucket, it's a relatively small amount. It takes a certain volume to get a measurement. And when you're measuring something like Throughfall or Stemflow, it's even smaller amount of water. So the novel idea here is to take several troughs. These rectangles are long troughs. And you take 3 of those troughs and have all the water together funneled to the rain gauge at the same time. So now you're greatly amplifying the signal. So, with sound or digital processing, you can have a simple signal amplifier. This is a physical, real-world amplifier of the signal by just capturing more water. It also has the benefit that instead of only sampling the water raining down or falling through a small spot at the gauge, you can collect all of that in these randomly located long troughs. So you're sampling much more of the canopy. And there are 3 of those gauges located: T6, T7, and T9. There's also one farther out that is outside the canopy to just get the gross precipitation and to get a significant amount of water, but only 1 trough is needed because there's just more water because there's no interception. Stemflow, similarly, there are 3 trees or 2 trees coming together to a single gauge. And then all of that has to run to a data logger, which is just shown here as a black square that records that information. There's also a manual rain gauge off on the side as another method. And there are also some what we call sap flow devices, which actually measure the flux of water through a tree to capture transpiration. And that's beyond the topic of this presentation, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. The main thing is that there's a canopy here, and they're measuring Throughfall and Stemflow by aggregating the flux from multiple trees or canopy areas to individual sensors. And this just summarizes that, so I'll leave you to read that on your own. You have the slides and you can look at that. Okay, so the fundamental result that was found in this study was that on average, interception represented 24% or 0.24 of gross precipitation on average. Now you may remember from the first part of this presentation in the earlier podcast that I showed you the example from Mythbusters. And with Mythbusters, they shot the golf balls horizontally through trees, and the golf ball got, it got 24 out of 100 through. Is that right? So basically then that had an interception of 75%, and here we have an interception of only 24%. We don't know what the throughfall is yet, but you can see that's actually a significantly different percentage that's in that case. It's essentially inverted. So water can make it through much more effectively. It's not 90% air, but it's more like 70-ish%. Another thing you can see here is we have a plot of precipitation on the x-axis, that's the gross precipitation, and then on the y-axis is the ratio of interception to precipitation. As precipitation increases, it's inevitable that the interception to precipitation ratio has to decrease simply because you're plotting 1 over precipitation. But it's also reflective of the fact that there's a lot more variability. So with a precipitation rate of about 3 millimeters, you could have anywhere from 40% to 100% of the water being captured. Whereas with a precipitation of 50%, you're down to around 3% to 20%. So the range gets substantially reduced. And you can see that the data pretty much asymptotes off, so that once you're above about 15 millimeters, it flattens out quite a bit. Certainly by 30, you can see that the variability drops and it's almost like a flat line. And that flat line is at about 15% of gross precipitation. So you have to think about, why does this matter? Like, why does interception vary as a function of increasing precipitation? So you should think about that for a minute and pause now. The answer to the question that I just asked has to do with the fact that initially, if you have a small amount of precipitation, you're not going to fill all of the space to store that water in the tree. So because of that, with small amounts of precipitation, as you go from tree to tree or storm to storm, there's a lot of variability in terms of the ability of the canopy to capture that water. However, when you have a very large storm, it doesn't really matter from tree to tree and storm to storm anymore, because you're basically overwhelming the capacity of a tree to hold the water, and so therefore the water is going to reach its capacity of storage, and then the rest is going to fall through. This is looking at a very similar data, but now just looking at the throughfall. So here 70% is making it through, as opposed to the golf ball case where only about 24% to 60% for the avid golfer who's making it through. So that suggests that water can make it through better than than large balls. And of course the water can hit the tree, attach to it, and then trickle off later on, whereas a golf ball isn't counted that way. So the throughfall, again, is highly variable for the same reason that interception was highly variable at low flows or low precipitation events, and much more consistent for high precipitation events. Okay. So notice that in this case, the y-axis is not on a percent basis or fractional basis. It's just showing us how much is occurring. To compare different areas of the canopy, this is a plot. It's a scatter plot. And so on the x-axis is the throughfall in millimeters from the array that goes to T7 or trough 7 array. And then on the y-axis we have throughfall, but it's for two different arrays. If you see triangles, it represents the T9 array, and the squares represent the T6 array. So this is a way of presenting essentially two plots in a more compact fashion against one, and that has benefits and it has detriments. So the data sort of overlaps, and as a result of that, it's hard to see the differences. But on the other hand, since they all overlap, it tells you that there's not a lot of differences. Also, the plot has a one-to-one line. So anywhere along that line, the x-axis is giving you the same value as the y-axis. And what this plot tells you is that the throughfall between T7 and T6, or T7 and T9, are highly correlated and fit a one-to-one plot. That means that throughfall in one section of the canopy is going to function very similarly as throughfall in another section of the canopy. When we do the same kind of analysis for Stemflow, it doesn't work out so well. It's kind of a mess. First of all, they didn't even bother to plot a one-to-one line because they're not even convinced that there's a one-to-one relationship that's here. I mean, roughly you can see something going up, but when you have data in the lower right and in the upper left, it's highly variable. Also notice, like in the previous plot, throughfall was 0 to 60 millimeters. Here, Stemflow is on the order of 0 to 2 millimeters. That's such a small amount of water, you're getting to the limit of the tipping bucket gauge to even measure that. So that's a real problem. So in this case, the variability can be partly due to just the increased amount of sensor noise compared to the signal of the data. And it also can be a result of the highly varying conditions that stem flow from one tree or a couple of trees in the S3 array is quite different from another group of trees. It's just such a small amount. It's much more sensitive to the characteristics of an individual tree. Okay, so let's move on to another case study. I think that first study gave you the sense that throughfall is roughly around 70% for the Scots pine, and that spatial variability is very high in Stemflow and very low in throughfall. That's the main thing. I didn't cover the temporal scaling component. It wasn't the most important, but that was a part of the study. If you want to look up that reference, you could read more about that. So now we're going to move to another part of the world, the wonderful temperate rainforest of Scotland. I had the pleasure of going to this area not too long ago and experiencing the forests, and it was snowing while I was there. So in this case, the same scenario, return to forest cover, and that's increasing interception, and thus that decreases the water yield for human consumptions. The water that is intercepted, we always infer that it's going to evaporate back to the atmosphere because it's sitting on the tree, and then the tree dries out, and so that evaporates away. So now we're going to start with the same question as we had before. What is the amount of interception in a forest in Highland Scotland? Except now we're going to have to deal with the fact that unlike the coastal Spain, it's a much more grueling setting in a mountainous forest where it's snowing. We're also going to look at the temporal variability just from week to week to week with this data. And then finally, it's not highly convincing, but there is a comparison, again, of the study data from this study against data from other literature values published in other journal articles. So here's an illustration just showing what this Sitka spruce looks like. It's the tallest conifer in North America. It grows to an average height of 55 to 80 meters and lives hundreds of years. It occurs all up and down the Pacific coast. It draws a lot of water out of fog. It can grow in pure stands, but it also can be in a mixed forest. In the case of this Highlands of Scotland example, they had a relatively large basin, and within that basin they had about a 900 square meter plot that had 87 Sitka spruce trees. Remember from the Scots pine study, there was 33 inches of rain per year, and here we have 87 inches of rain. So it's substantially more rain that's present, and some of this precipitation is also falling as snow. There's a lower density of stems, only 967 stems per hectare, but that works out to about 1 stem per meter, so that's still pretty dense. The diameters of these trees are dramatically bigger than the ones from the Scots pine. The trees are spaced out, but their canopy is interlocking, and the trees are twice as tall, and they're a little bit older. So we're basically looking at a forest with bigger, more substantial trees, and it's substantially more work to do a study like this. In this case, the field methods consisted of not using tipping bucket rain gauges because tipping bucket rain gauge can't handle snow. The snow would just pile up on top. Now they do make some heated tipping bucket rain gauges that in theory, if they keep up with the rate of snowfall, can melt the snow and have it go, but that becomes very expensive. You need a lot of energy. So in this case, they just took standard manual buckets, but not just any bucket, a rain gauge, but it's essentially just a bucket. And the snow, these gauges are placed either at ground level, above the ground, or higher off the ground, particularly to capture the snow. Then what they did is they measured throughfall by taking those same kind of storage gauges and randomly locating 60 of these gauges through the forest. Because of the amount of work it takes in this setting, they just located them one time randomly. They didn't move them around through the course of the study. Sometimes that's done to sample the different areas of the canopy, but in this case they just had these 60 locations randomly selected. Stemflow is measured on 9 out of 87 trees, and that water went to plastic buckets basically to collect the water. They also made some tree morphology measurements to try to relate things to aspects of the tree, including canopy distance, like how far away from the trunk was a section of canopy where a gauge was located. So that's the distance from stem to gauge. Yeah, I'm sorry, that was the distance. The canopy density, so just how dense was the canopy, and then a compass direction. Over a couple of years, they visited when they could, which resulted in 54 visits at unequal intervals. And this is the primary plot. On the x-axis is date in 1983 to 1986. On the y-axis is the percent interception. You can see that it is highly variable. You could ask the question, is this time series random or non-random? And later in the quarter, when we look at hydrological regimes for streams, we'll look at a tool called the computing the run. So runs above or below the median value, which is a test for randomness. That could be applied here. It wasn't in this study, but it's something that I would do if I was doing the study. We can see that the average values, on average, interception was a little bit higher, 28%. Throughfall, though, about the same, 69 to 70%, and Stemflow of 3%. So Stemflow is just such a small amount. It's so tough. But the interception varied from 0 up to 79%. So it's marked as much by its variability as it is by the idea of an average value of about 28%. In 1 year, there was more interception in the summer than there was in the winter. And in the other year, there was more interception in the winter than the summer. In the wintertime, high interception rates are promoted by snow. So the snow can lump together, and that aggregation can build up disproportionately and intersect. It's what we call a positive feedback, because once you block the pathways of air or snow through a tree, then you can capture everything. Like the canopy becomes closed and you capture 100% or so. In this other instance, the summer might be higher than the winter if, in this case, there was, of course, less snow, but also if you have deciduous forests, and the deciduous part of that canopy, even though the Sitka spruce isn't deciduous, other parts of the canopy could be, and as a result of that, there could be a higher collection in the canopy or in the understory. This is a plot that shows distance from the stem of the tree, so stem would be located at 0, and then going to the canopy edge, and this is percent distance to the edge of the canopy. So 100% would be at the full distance of the canopy. And so the gauges were all located randomly, and so that meant that they gave an array of such distances. And what you see here is a best fit line plotted on the scatter data. The dots are the scatter data. You can see that this is an older study, so they're hand plotted, but now you could use this using a spreadsheet software. And you can see that there's a pretty good fit. The data is about equally distributed across the line, except for at the very top. There isn't enough sampling, perhaps. And so overall, you can see that throughfall does increase as you get closer to the edge of the canopy, and we can interpret that to mean that the canopy is less dense, that at the stem you have many branches and tree trunks, but by the time you get far away, there's relatively few branches at the farthest corners of a tree. And then lastly, in this study, they did an analysis of different studies, and so each one of these names and symbols represents a different study done in the UK, and on the x-axis is the age of the stand in those other studies, and then on the y-axis is the percent of either Stemflow or Throughfall, and you can infer interception otherwise. So for young trees, like trees that were only about 15 years old, Cleater found that there was about only 60% Throughfall, and then Throughfall increased as the trees got older. Now, with only 4 data points, it's hard to show a lot. And then, of course, by definition, when a tree is born, canopy just begins, there has to be 100% Throughfall because there's no canopy. So somehow Throughfall has to increase as a tree goes from a seed to a sapling and on up to a full-size tree. It reaches its maximum Throughfall at some age, and then over time branches may break off and the tree may start to go into decline. And so then Throughfall is always the inverse, although I don't know why you'd have Stemflow at 40%. That's pretty high. You'd think there'd be, this almost suggests that there's no interception. But in any case, it just gives you the idea that as a function of age of a tree or age of a stand of trees, that you would expect to see changes in these hydrological fluxes. Okay, now we're going to shift gears. I don't want to cover too much about the tropics per se, but focusing on different ways of measuring and analyzing these fluxes relative to vegetative parameters. I found a really cool study that just came out a couple years ago that looked in the monsoon rainy season of northern Thailand. And so you have this high seasonality, kind of like we have here in California, but like 1.2 to 2 meters of rain, so that's a huge amount of water compared to what we have here. Here there is a lot of evergreens and some deciduous trees, and this just shows where the forest plot was located. Now this is a little bit more complicated experimental design because it focuses a lot on the spatial pattern. So let me explain this. In the upper left are 20 boxes, and they're numbered, I guess, vertically. The 20 boxes are each 5 meter by 5 meter plots for a total of 25 square meters per plot. For each of these plots, they made leaf area index measurements. Those LAI measurements were made as shown in this plot labeled as F. You see how there are 5 in a staggered grid, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so there were 5 measurements made. This is like a staggered uniform distribution. So not randomly, but to balance the measurements throughout the canopy. So that's the distribution of leaf area index measurements. And then they looked at that canopy, and the canopy is illustrated with these different size circles, and they put in troughs. So just like in the first study I showed you, these troughs are very long. I mean, these are the 5 meter boxes. It's the same setup as shown in these other plots. There are 4 trough data loggers, or like tipping bucket gauges, and you can see how they're funneling. And so the yellow polygonal area illustrates the canopy that's draining to the troughs. In addition to those 4 static troughs, they had 20 roving buckets that they put in different locations during different storms. So the key question here, which is why I'm showing this to you, is not so much the spatial pattern, which is interesting, but it's more that is there a correlation between throughfall and leaf area index? Conceptually, the higher the leaf area index, remember from the last video podcast, leaf area index is the measure of the projected area of the leaves, one-sided leaf area. So as a result of that, higher leaf area index should result in a higher interception. Here is an example of the distribution of leaf area index on the left and throughfall on the right. So one way to answer the question is to just make a visual comparison. And when I look at this visually, I don't see that areas of white here with low leaf area index necessarily correspond. So like this lower right cell has the lowest leaf area index, and yet it doesn't have the lowest throughfall. This one to the right has the lowest throughfall, about 30%, but it has a relatively high leaf area index. Notice that compared to that satellite image that I showed you from Africa that had a leaf area index from 0 to 6, here we have a leaf area index from 0 to 4. So we can look at these spatial patterns, and you can see it's highly splotchy. I mean, each one of these dark circles represents probably an individual gauge, and so you have to have some way of interpolating from one gauge to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's a whole branch of science known as geostatistics. So that's a graduate level course that we have in our program, but it's not so easy to do. Throughfall, of course, does increase as a function of rainfall depth. Note that this is a log-log plot, so showing wide range of both rainfall and throughfall. And this is like the plot I showed for the very first lecture, just introducing basic concepts in math. Here there's no lines to help you out, but you could infer that this is probably around 7 or 8, and then here it's a value of 10, just to give you a feel. Now here's the relationship between leaf area index on the x-axis and throughfall. It's a scatter plot. But you can see that in this case, there's no tight response. So on the left, here's a tight response. On the right, you could just call this a shotgun. It's like, like someone sneezed all over the screen here, and you just have points everywhere, and there doesn't seem to be any relation. So having no leaves at all, you could have a throughfall of 65% to 115%. Now this raises an interesting question. how do you have a higher percent throughfall than you had rainfall? And actually, that's the same thing here. Notice how the throughfall here goes well above 100%. So think about that for a minute. The answer to that question is that the rainfall is rainfall per unit area. And so if you have Stemflow, Stemflow can aggregate more water, concentrate water, and then it can fall through. So a partial Stemflow, not down the actual tree trunk, but just some branches aggregating water and then having that drizzle off in one spot could accumulate a higher intensity of water in throughfall than you had in precipitation. Okay, so anyway, you can see a wide range of values, and there's simply no trend here. So this is a little bit disturbing because I've already told you in the earlier video podcast that leaf area index is our primary tool for characterizing the vegetation. Well, what good is a primary tool if it doesn't work? Well, leaf area index may work for a lot of other things, but at least in this one study, it didn't work, and we'll have to keep an eye on that through the course to see how it functions. This is one last example I want to show you. It's another spatial pattern, but in this case, looking at one site through 4 different storms. So in this case, it's the Pacific Northwest, about 6-year-old even-age stand of young conifers, consisting of Douglas fir, and big leaf maple. In this case, the black dots are trees, not to scale, but scaled relative to the size of each other. These are 3 meter by 3 meter. I think this is 3 meters between the hatches. So it's like 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 meters by 15 meters square plot. The white squares are throughfall collectors, and then the sides of the squares are proportional to the throughfall. So like in this event here, you can see that there's more throughfall at these individual gauges compared to this other storm. Now that's scaled to the total volume. And then the patterns that are shown here are the percent of throughfall. So the patterns show, so if you look, the main question is, do you see a persistent pattern of throughfall in this domain from storm to storm? And you can clearly see that this one tree here has a persistent amount of throughfall that's happening in all of these. But other locations, like generally a little bit more off on this side, and you see an arc up on the top, but it's not exactly measured here. So you can look at it qualitatively, or you could do a raster by raster correlation analysis to see what's happening for the whole spatial domain. But I just want to show you this is evolving from just looking at a few sensors to using relatively large numbers of sensors and trying to assess these spatial patterns. Okay, so in summary, what this video podcast has shown you is different examples of how scientists have addressed the challenge of quantifying throughfall, interception, and Stemflow using different methods for spatial data collection, spatial correlation, and as well as temporal patterns, looking at the age of stands, different types of vegetation. We've seen that overall interception and throughfall and Stemflow occur in relatively similar amounts in the different kinds of forests that we've seen so far. And we've also seen a pattern that across all these studies, there seems to be a reality in the world that areas of land are being abandoned and they're afforesting.